Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's evening conversation on faith, dignity, and empowerment. We're delighted that each of you could join us tonight. As many of you know, that this is the second in a 5-part series of evening conversations that we're doing on the broad theme of faith and international development, with the help of New Venture Fund and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to do this series. And we're really excited that each of you have joined us here tonight. We kicked off this series several months ago. We had Mike Gerson and Stephen Bowman in to talk about the topic of who is our neighbor and how do we think faithfully about international development. Well, I'll introduce our speakers in just a second tonight. Over the next few months, we're going to hear from other speakers as well. And on September 28th, we'll be welcoming World Bank President Dr. Jim Yong Kim to speak about international poverty alleviation. On October 16th, we'll have Jenny Dyer, who's the Executive Director of Hope Through Healing Hands, to talk about global health. And later in the year, we'll have a real treat and get to hear from Rick Stearns and Peter Greer on poverty fighting abroad and the challenges that faith-based organizations face. We're really excited to be able to present this series, a new one for us and a new topic, in order to kind of deal with some of the big questions that surround faith-based organizations and international development issues. So I look out over the audience and I see many new faces here tonight. If this is your first Trinity Forum event, a particular welcome to you. Those of you who are new may not have heard about our purpose and our mission, and delighted to tell you a little bit about that. We try to provide a space and resources for leaders to engage life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And we do that through many ways. We publish quarterly readings that bring the best of literature and letters to thoughtful professionals. We also sponsor events such as this to try to connect leading thinkers with thinking leaders in engaging those bigger questions of life, not only in order to ask better questions, but ultimately to come to better know the author of the answers. And certainly, one of the great questions of life is how to care for those in need in a way that recognizes their dignity and enhances their flourishing, which in turn requires an understanding of what human dignity is, where it comes from, what it means, and why it matters. For millennia, Jews and Christians alike have grounded that idea that each person has dignity and worth in the idea of the imago Dei. That is, that each person is made in the image of God, and as such is of inherent value, whatever their level of ability, resources, pedigree, or even moral virtue. The stain of sin or selfishness may mar, but never erase the stamp of the divine upon each human life. And as such, the value of human life and freedom is a reality to be recognized rather than a status to be conferred. Of course, such a view was never perfectly followed, nor was it universally adopted. But this notion of human dignity has had really extraordinary influence in shaping discussions and debate over human rights and development efforts. Its echoes can be found in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and many of our international institutions will give at least lip service to the idea that all people retain innate dignity. But of course, it's one thing to affirm human dignity, and quite another to develop institutions, structures, and policies that recognize and protect it wisely and well. Moreover, concerns around human dignity are often superseded by a focus on more easily measurable indicators of material well-being. So what implications do faith-based notions of human dignity hold for how we should work for the flourishing and empowerment of others in developing countries? To what extent should international development efforts focus on human dignity vis-a-vis economic opportunity? What obligations are imposed in terms of working towards protecting the rights of the vulnerable living in repressive lands that may not recognize their dignity or their rights? This field, of course, has many hairy questions with no easy answers, but there are few who have engaged those questions with more expertise, insight, diplomacy, or wisdom than our keynote speaker tonight, Dr. Mark Lagon. Mark has, for many years, been considered an expert and a thought leader on global institutions, governance, global health, and human rights policy. He serves as the Chief Policy Officer at Friends of the Global Fight Against AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, and a distinguished senior scholar at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He previously served as the president of Freedom House, the research nonprofit aimed at advancing democracy worldwide, and the Global Politics and Security Chair at Georgetown University, as well as adjunct senior fellow for human rights as the Council on Foreign Relations. He previously was the CEO of Polaris, the leading anti-trafficking NGO, and has served as a number of senior roles in the State Department, including the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Organizations and Ambassador at Large to combat human trafficking. He's also a founding member of the Global Business Coalition Against Human Trafficking and co-editor, along with Anthony Arend, who I believe is also here tonight, of Human Dignity and the Future of Global Institutions, as well as the co-author of the book, The Reagan Doctrine. Responding to Ambassador Lagon will be Dr. Catherine Marshall. Catherine has over 4 decades of experience and expertise in international development, where she's focused on the world's poorest countries. She serves as a senior fellow at Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and professor of the practice of development, religion, and conflict in the School of Foreign Service. She's also the executive director of the World Faiths Development Dialogue, which aims to bridge the gulfs separating religion and faith communities from development. During her long and distinguished career at the World Bank, she served as counselor to the president on ethics, value, and faith development, and held various leadership assignments focused on development in Africa, Latin America, and East Asia. She's also a trustee at Princeton University, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and has authored several books, including Women, Religion, and Peacebuilding, and Global Institutions of Religion, Ancient Movers, Modern Shakers. At the conclusion of Mark's remarks, Catherine will provide a response, which will be followed by a moderated conversation between the three of us, and then, of course, over to audience questions. Mark, welcome.
Well, it's a special pleasure to be here. I've said this to Cherie one-on-one, but something special happens here at this forum. It is thought-provoking, and it's a high standard to meet. And it's a special pleasure that Catherine will be joining the conversation, someone familiar with my thinking, but always exacting in her constructive criticism, and you will be as lucky to hear from her as anybody tonight. Like Catherine, I'm an Episcopalian. I owe it to my wife that I am of that faith. She got me churched as an adult, and I wanted, instead of quoting the scripture, to quote the Book of Common Prayer, because it, for those of us who are Episcopalians, is a bridge from Scripture through Sunday to everyday life. Every time my wife and I, my mother or my daughter, observe a child being baptized, we are called upon to renew our commitment through the baptismal covenant. The celebrant will say, "Will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being?" To which we answer, "I will, with God's help." I've been lucky in a number of occasions to think a little bit more tangibly about what that respect for the dignity of every human being entails. One such time was when I was the U.S. Ambassador at Large to combat human trafficking in 2008. I was in Chennai, India, and I was accompanying the local field office director, Philip Langford, of International Justice Mission. He's now a vice president of that wonderful, disciplined, faith-based organization. That then young man, and a little less young man now, had given up his job as a partner in a Chattanooga, Tennessee law firm for a higher calling. He introduced me to a couple who I'll leave anonymous, who had been liberated from bonded labor, Dalits. And I sat in what we as Americans would consider a squalid little hut, which they were very proud of as the home that they had gotten, funded by the state. The man and the couple had been caught in bonded labor, not in a rice mill, not in a brick kiln, but a sweet stall, a stall selling sweets, where he was caught in endless labor and couldn't leave because of debt bondage. They had such pride in their tiny home. At the time, only 10,000 people in populous India had taken advantage of a law passed 32 years earlier in 1976 to ban bonded labor and give restitution to those liberated from it. A gap of law on paper with law in actuality. This was a moment of thinking about people claiming their dignity with pride, their ability to thrive. I've been lucky through my life to be exposed in a way that informs my own faith, but also some thinking about policy, to those who have been treated as less than human. Human trafficking and slavery survivors, like those I met in Chennai, through some work on the United Nations at the State Department and elsewhere, seeing how those dehumanized in Sudan, Christians in the South, non-Arabs in Darfur, fecklessly dealt with by the UN, and now and earlier in my career, observing how AIDS and the stigma associated with AIDS have been confronted with a near Marshall Plan in the form of PEPFAR and the Global Fund. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that with some examples. These experiences actually also informed a book. I worked with my dear friend Tony Arend at Georgetown University in a collected volume. Sri kindly suggested we make the book available here tonight. It wasn't my idea, it was kindly hers. But these examples of people who are treated as less than human, partially human, not deserving of that inherent set of rights and form of respect is what sort of informs my remarks tonight. Now, this is a series that I've been invited to speak in on development issues. And I think it's interesting the way in which people who are of the three Abrahamic faiths and people who are secular universalists get to a similar place on issues of dignity and development. Those of the Abrahamic faiths, of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, they tend to think that individuals have inherent value because they're made in the image of a creator. They think that people have gifts from the creator, from God, and that they should be able to tap them and thrive, and that you must help the most vulnerable. On the other hand, those who are sort of on a secular universalist path of thinking have a kind of more Kantian view, or they may be of other cultures, but they would have a view that people should not be used as means. They have value in and of themselves. They must be the agents of what goes on in the world and of economic activity. It's views embedded in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. The reason for human rights are human dignity, as the opening of the Universal Declaration suggests. They look at the capabilities of people and how they need to be tapped. If you look at the thinking that the Indian economist Amartya Sen or Martha Nussbaum, now at the University of Chicago, helped embed in the work of the UN Development Program, they're looking at this very idea that Sri referred to of human flourishing. Poverty alleviation and focusing on the most marginalized populations is one of the emphases of this path of thinking of secular universalists. Those are rather similar ways of thinking with different terms. Well, if you look at where these two paths converge, I think it's worth establishing a definition of dignity. Tony Arend and I, when we put together an edited volume that came out 3 years ago, we thought we owed it to those who read it and we hoped would talk about the book to offer our own definition of dignity. Not that it would be the be-all and end-all, but it would be a starting point for dialogue. We hope to encourage dialogue in global institutions on dignity. But we suggest it has 3 elements: agency, people being able to act autonomously and use their gifts and thrive; recognition, that people crave by nature, as suggested by Francis Fukuyama, recognition as having value, and that people live in a social context. They are not atomized individuals, and so they must be recognized in whatever social community they're in as having value. But that thirdly, there has to be implementation and institutionalization of those 2 other things, agency and recognition. Otherwise, there's no value to it. So the development field really must set these 3 things as goals, in my mind. And it should try and measure them. And that's really what the UN's Millennium Development Goals aim towards 2015 and its Sustainable Development Goals aimed towards 2030 are supposed to do. When the aforementioned International Justice Mission got money from the Gates Foundation, funder of this speaker series, when the Gates Foundation gave the International Justice Mission funding to see whether its programs against child sex trafficking in the Philippines were working, that is precisely the measuring to see whether agency and recognition are being implemented. And it's very important. In the field that I'm now working in, there are probably even better metrics. Actually, there are far better metrics than in the human trafficking field. And looking at whether agency and recognition are actually being achieved is really what's so important about metrics. When people in the AIDS field talk about 90-90-90, 90% of those having AIDS being aware of it through testing, 90% of those getting treatment, and 90% of those having suppression of the disease, you need to really look whether agency and recognition of all people of having value, including some key marginalized populations like gay men, intravenous drug users, and those in the sex industry are being reached. With regard to agency and recognition, let's be frank. There are people of the Abrahamic faiths who form convenient exceptions in their mind. Some believers in those 3 Abrahamic faiths. Those who are Christians who care more about the religious freedom of Christians or terrorism against Christians, which may explain why some people are so seized with ISIS. Christians who care, pray, and do good works for victims of human trafficking or of atrocities such as in Sudan and Syria, but don't quite treat gay people or persons in prostitution as human beings in full. Some Zionists of Judaism who don't fully accord Palestinians civic or economic inclusion. And of course, some Muslims who leave out non-Muslims as infidel, not being accorded dignity, or other sects of Muslims, such as the appalling treatment of Sunni Muslims, of Shia Muslims by Saudi Arabia. There is commensurately a failure on the part of some within the secular universalist path, and that is the overemphasis on identity politics. And I commend to you, as a number of people have recently commented, I commend to you Mark Lagon's book, The Once and Future Liberal. And that book points out the perils of overemphasis on particular identities. Tony Arend and I grappled in our book with how you need to meet people and their needs based on some things that are special about them, groups they are in, such as being disabled or particular other features. But it is important to remember that as you try and deal with the particular problems of people in development policy, such as the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria is about to launch in a few months a HER campaign to focus on the needs of women and girls, that in doing that as a proper policy matter, that you recall the value of every human being is that they're in there being a human, as opposed to necessarily being part of the group that they come from. Well, a dignitarian approach when applied to development should look at development as prosperity, as market-based, to look at that question of people thriving. It can't be a disembodied concept of development. It really needs to look at how people grow personally and grow collectively. It needs to think about the value of people so that if people are left out, such as women in the Middle East, they are squandered assets. This is not only something that is informed by faith, but just thinking about things in terms of economic growth. Whether slaves or women in the Gulf, they're being left out from being fully productive. They're not just flourishing, they're not just failing to flourish as individuals, but they're not contributing to overall economic growth. Those of faith, hopefully, acquire a kind of prudence, a kind of, beyond the inspiration of faith, a kind of skepticism about, as Christians do, the sense that humans are fallen and they have an imperfect nature, and it should inject a kind of skepticism about some fads or areas of excessive enthusiasm in the development field. And that may include microfinance, microloans, some discussion of blended funding called innovative finance, what I like to call buddy systems, which is pairing up entrepreneurs and business people in the North with someone that they can help in the South, but that only sort of goes so far, you know, woman-to-woman buddy system type things that one sees among some NGOs. Celebrities, charismatic NGO leaders, marvelous, but they only go so far in development. Crowdfunding in development, seen as, you know, using the power of the internet, but the antithesis of strategic prioritization in development policy, one could never find a better example of as crowdfunding. And of course, the internet and media as great empowerers. Those of faith should have a sort of skepticism, about whether social media will liberate all or be an agent of those who are trying to recruit for violence or sex trafficking and the like. There's some more enduring elements to a dignity-based approach. Partnerships with business that use businesses' comparative advantages, not just the fact that they have a big wallet. Civil society being central to development partnerships. Debt relief. I had the occasion of being in the now famous meeting between Bono and the late Jesse Helms, in which Bono begged Helms to support debt relief at the time of the millennium, and Helms responded by saying, "I will, but help the money not go to corrupt dictatorships." Debt relief still is a really important tool, often better than aid or more loans. And, importantly, a dignitarian approach needs to remember that intergovernmental organizations, for all of their faults, like the World Bank or the UN, and government foreign aid, have their problems, but they are still important catalysts. I think a dignity-based approach needs to account for holism. Now, sometimes secular universalists tend to have a holistic view. I sometimes cringe when I start hearing someone use the word holistic, because there is the tendency to suggest that everything is important, and so therefore, as a result, nothing is important. But an understanding from either the Abrahamic path or the secular universalist path recognizes that dignity and empowerment are multifaceted. Let's look at one example. Rwanda. Rwanda is a remarkable success story since the genocide of 1994 under the leadership of Paul Kagame, of Empowering women politically after the genocide kind of helps if, in fact, many of the men of society were indeed wiped out in a short period of time. Grappling with calamitous health problems and really noteworthy success on dealing with HIV/AIDS, and economic dynamism. It's just Rwanda's a remarkable economy. And yet, there's terrible corruption given the interlocking party ownership of, a company, Crystal Ventures, that controls everything from real estate to milk processing, which means the head of the country has control over $50 million in assets. Associates of Paul Kagame, who came out in the Panama Papers because of secret offshore holdings. Whistleblowers and opposition figures who have died in detention. Opposition figures murdered in South Africa and neighboring countries of East Africa. And, of course, the head of state, acting like many heads of state, getting to be leader for life, term limits extended to let him serve another 17 years. Well, as I attended a board meeting of the Global Fund, this hero of the donor community, Paul Kagame, spoke, and it just occurred to me that this was one part of empowerment that was being left out. Conversely, it's important for those, especially who are politically conservative, not to over-imbibe the notion that economic and social rights are not human rights. And I think this is something we can learn from faith and the faith perspective, particularly the Christian perspective on dignity. I'm influenced by the thinking of Irene Khan, former head of Amnesty International, and her book, The Unheard Truth, by Gary Haugen, and his book, The Locust Effect. He spoke on it here in the Trinity Forum, and Amartya Sen in his book, Development is Freedom. They all suggest that you need to look at freedom as having two lobes, the political part and the economic part. And that, I think, is seen in why not only education is a crucial part of human rights and development, but health. Health is a crucial part. Let's just think about pandemic disease and where we've gone on AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria from 2000 to 2015. There were 2 million people a year dying of AIDS in 2005. It was down to 1.1 million in 2015, a plague halved in 10 years. TB, the mortality rate, has gone down markedly in countries where the Global Fund works, down from 2.6 million to 2,000 in 2000 to 1.5 million in 2015. Malaria, the most vulnerable to malaria are kids under 5. The number of them has gone down from about 725,000 dying a year in 2000, down by 69%. Those are enabling things. Left unaddressed, pandemic disease prevents people from going to school and being educated, pulls them out of work to care for their loved ones who have the disease. And for HIV/AIDS, the most productive and reproductive people in the age cohort that it hits are prevented from flourishing and contributing to economic development. As I move towards closing, I want to leave you with the story of Lois Matera, and I thank my colleague John McManus from the Friends of the Global Fight, who sort of called my attention to her. She was from Zimbabwe, a country troubled by a brutal leader, riven by hyperinflation, many other barriers to flourishing, but she was born with HIV. She's now 25 years old. She lost her brother and mother to HIV before she was 10. She didn't start receiving antiretroviral treatment until she was 12, at which point she was also diagnosed as having TB. She suffered from acute stigma, verbal abuse from her relatives. She had to miss school. She had a hard time finding money to get to the clinics that she had access to, so real access to treatment wasn't there. She attempted suicide. And yet, she became a beneficiary of a development program of a civil society actor, Africaid, and she got help from peer counselors, and then she became one herself, and is now an advocate and living fully. She said, being HIV positive doesn't mean it's the end of the world. HIV is in the blood and not in the brain to make you stop thinking, and it's not in your heart to make you stop loving either. So this is one reason why health is so crucial, and why implementation of policy really matters. This is, it's a striking comparison between the World Health Organization stumbling under the leadership of Margaret Chan in dealing with Ebola. Hopefully it will be improved as the former Ethiopian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dr. Tedros, has taken over, as compared to the Global Fund, which, as a public-private partnership model, has stumbled at times, had troubles with accountability, and then righted its course because it had a nimbleness as a public-private partnership. These are the ways that you need to, in a more holistic way, rightly understood, deal with things. A closing thought. To summarize, in a cheeky way, I offer 10 commandments of dignity and development. Thou shalt not fail to recognize how the faith-based and secular universalistic paths converge. Thou shalt not fail to treat someone as a human being in full. Thou shalt not create convenient but insidious exceptions for certain people. Thou shalt not worship an identity of people over their values as human beings, while, as my colleague Tony and I emphasize, tailoring policy to those based on their particular needs. Thou shalt not forget that all people are endowed with gifts and potential that needs to be tapped. Thou shalt not forget that some people are that people are economic assets. Thou shalt not delay or deprioritize political and civil liberties. Thou shalt conversely not deny the validity of economic and social rights. Thou shalt not forget that health is a crucial enabler or disenabler of development and dignity. And finally, thou shalt not neglect implementation and institutionalization. And so I end by returning to the Book of Common Prayer for we Episcopalians. Form 5 of the Prayers of the People rightly includes the passage that we pray for those in positions of public trust, that they may serve justice and promote the dignity and freedom of every person. Leaders and stewards of institutions, whether the World Bank, the UN, the Global Fund, nations in the Global South, or the leaders of the United States, need our prayer and our vigilance that they are actually prioritizing the dignity for all people created in God's image. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mark. That's a hard act to follow with a very rich menu of commandments and challenges. I have to admit, I've been thinking about this issue of dignity and the way that Mark and Tony have framed it for several years, and I think it's a very rich and important concept, but it's also one that's not easy to come to terms with. I'm still trying to balance where the sort of rights approach versus dignity actually sort of leads you when you deal with floods or sanitation or any of those issues. So I start by my own confession of being in a process of considering it. But I thought what I would do, I don't have 10, I have 5 points because I have 5 minutes. So I thought I would at least throw out a few more provocations. So the first point is that one of the common themes that seems to link all faith traditions is what's called the Golden Rule in its different forms. And in some senses, if you think about it, it is sort of the ultimate dignity of essentially equating yourself and your own interests, your own needs, your own perspectives with those of anyone else, whether they're in Laos or whether they're in Australia or wherever. But this principle is one, interestingly, that Karen Armstrong the scholar, has taken as the core of the Charter of Compassion, as, in a sense, her effort to rewrite all of the ethical texts and to distill it into one principle. And it is quite true that you can find that in any one of the world's great traditions, some form of the idea, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So in a sense, a core principle. The second is one of the topics that many people who work in development are grappling with, and it seems to be one that's particularly challenging for people who come at issues with a combination of faith and secular, and that's the tension between charity and rights. And sort of at the crudest level, charity is the ancient admonition, the ancient call to care, to give, to focus on helping people out of pure compassion, out of a sense of compassion. Whereas when organizations talk about a rights-based approach, for example, that was something that CARE International focused on very sharply for some years, the idea was that that was different. And in many ways, the sort of core of thinking about development today is that you don't do it because of charity. You do it because it's right, but you also do it because it's in the common interests of everyone. But it's still a sharp tension because you don't want to lose the good aspects of charity, which is caring and compassion, in a sense, the humanity which is inherent in the notion of dignity. You don't want to lose the notion of rights, which in some sense, when you look at all sorts of documents, whether they're religious or secular, constitutions, United Nations documents, the notion of rights is this sense that everyone should have certain possibilities, but also a sense of equality and equity, a balance. So how do you have this rights-based approach at the same time that you don't lose the benefits of charity? And interestingly, in the history of charity, one of the interesting observations is that very often charity in the olden days was much more about the benefit to the individual who gave than to the individual who received. And that, I think, is still a tension, even as we're now struggling with responding to Harvey, or even to responding to the horrible floods in the subcontinent or in Sierra Leone or any of the other horrific things that are happening now. How do we find this balance between trying to do what's right and treating the people who you're trying to help as genuinely part of the solution, genuinely equal to the one who's giving, even though we all know that he who pays the piper has at least some element of power in the sense of calling the tune. So that's the second. The third, and this is, I think, very much illustrated and comes out of Mark's observations about the HIV/AIDS crisis. It is quite striking that the HIV/AIDS epidemic really now is primarily an issue of the most vulnerable groups. And I think that it is a very fair comment that a society can be judged by the way it treats the least among it. It's, I think it's something that we often say, but that is a very real force, particularly in this day when everyone knows what's happening to everyone else. So what are these vulnerable groups? Now, with HIV/AIDS, it's pretty clear who they are. They are the men who have sex with men. They are the prostitutes. They are people in prison. They're drug users. They're a whole very specific set of groups. But there's a group that I do want to highlight that is the most vulnerable groups in many societies is adolescent girls who have tremendous vulnerability. So it is first of all, the capacity to focus on these groups, but secondly, it is also the willingness to overcome generations of stigma, discrimination, and barriers in order to deal with them. A fourth set of comments is around this word empowerment. I think the word empowerment, inclusion, dignity, these are all very big terms and very difficult ones. I think the journey towards empowerment is an interesting one because I've traveled it in many senses. I think it started with, of course, a sort of a sense that there was a right solution and there was a sort of a magic recipe. And then gradually, as the sort of experts sometimes fell flat on their faces, you had a sense that we really need to consult people. So you went to consultation. And then after a while, consultation never seemed quite enough, so you went to participation. So you had, focus groups, and you actually had people, you might even have people participating in local government. But now the focus has gone much more towards empowerment, which is, first of all, a sense that very often people know what's best for them. But even more, it's finding the ways to let them follow their own objectives while not giving up the idea that there is progress, there is technological progress, and there is much to be learned from others. So I think empowerment, like dignity, is a very difficult concept and a difficult term that many of us are struggling with. And finally, I want to come to the point that Mark emphasized very much, which is implementation. In other words, many people have the will, they have it in their souls to treat other people with the dignity and compassion and caring, the sense of justice. But when it actually comes to making decisions, whether they're political leaders or they're ordinary people going about their daily lives and making thousands of choices every day. But in the implementation, there are a couple of things that I want to emphasize. I think, first of all, clearly, the issue of data is important. Why is it that of all the Millennium Development Goals that were the central sort of global agenda between 2000 and 2015, it was maternal mortality that was the slowest, that had the slowest progress, far below targets? It's because people aren't recording when mothers die in childbirth. And likewise, the sanitation targets, the extraordinary issues of open defecation and so on. Part of the problem is that it's so hard to measure, so hard to see. So this issue of measurement is critical. I've always thought that it's ironic that every single stock is reported publicly on a second-by-second basis, but we don't know how children are doing in school. We don't have data on it. One of my current things is we don't really have data on how many people are in religious schools, and the estimates of the share of religious healthcare that's provided by religious organizations range. I promise you that people, respectable people, not fake news, say is somewhere between 7 and 70%. That's an awfully wide range. So I think that this issue of data has a much greater importance than people recognize, and likewise information. I mean, we're seeing that today with the gap between the people dying in the floods in South Asia and the people dying in this country, how the way that the media focuses has tremendous importance on implementation and on understanding, and obviously the issue of political will and the determination to live to our better angels, to live to the better values that our societies, deep down, I think we believe, have to offer. So, thank you.
Well, Well, thank you both for that fascinating discussion. And Mark, I really appreciate the fact that you started out with definitions, something speakers don't often do, and wanted to ask you about your definition of dignity. Obviously, it's not just in the area of international development, but one of the other areas where notions of dignity have been so important and so, in many ways, controversial have been end-of-life issues. So I wanted to ask you about your inclusion of agency as being essential to the idea of dignity. For many people of faith in particular, a lack of agency, in fact, it's precisely those who lack agency at end of life are the most vulnerable, where protection and recognition of dignity is the most important. So I wanted to ask you how your definition of dignity squares with the innate dignity of people who may not be in a position to be exercising agency.
Well, this is a good question, and by including agency and recognition as pillars, there's sometimes tensions between the two. And as someone who spent a bunch of time in my life on human trafficking, and much more than end-of-life issues, I will say, there's sometimes tensions between whether you are helping the victim of human trafficking get on their feet for a new life, or go after the person who was their tormentor, and the tension. Clearly, there is a problem of that tension between the two with end-of-life issues. I think it's not just development, which was clearly what was in the mind of Amartya Sen, who's a big advocate of agency, that is an important part of all of these issues. If someone is able to speak to their own future, I certainly see that as the reason that human trafficking is best thought of as slavery, removal of autonomy. But you are confronted, if someone's in a vegetative state, with them not being able to exercise their agency. And so you hit a kind of brick wall there.
Mm-hmm. Catherine, anything to add?
No, I think there's some other issues that are also interesting. Mm-hmm. Clearly, one of them is around children and the rights of children, and the rights of the mentally disabled, which is clearly one of the most vulnerable groups that we're grappling with how to deal with that.
For both of you, is the rule of law a necessary precondition for the respect of human dignity? And if so, does that mean more emphasis should be placed on it, or placed on it first, vis-a-vis economic considerations?
Well, it's kind of hinting at that chicken and egg problem of the political and civil rights versus economic and social rights. I really think you need to pursue them in tandem. I will not subscribe to the view that you have to deal with poverty and economic and social rights exclusively first and not grapple with rule of law. But I will say that there's sort of an additional question beyond the one that you raised, which is the actual implementation of rule of law. It's access to justice. It's like the rule of law in practice that is the thing that's necessary. And that, I think, desperately does need emphasis and is crucial to development.
Mm-hmm. I'm quite persuaded by the arguments that such a tiny fraction of the world's people have any kind of meaningful access to justice, and to see that as something that should have a higher priority. Mm-hmm. That said, I think the sort of other side of it is that there are other ways to have justice within communities, within families. I mean, there's a whole range of ways in which some of these principles are lived out in daily life. Mm-hmm. And clearly in societies where having a fully functioning police and judicial system is likely to be a ways off, I think one may also need to work with some of the other systems. I mean, we're seeing that, for example, in some of the reconciliation programs after horrific violence and terrible times that people have lived. So I think that there is always the danger of having our own concept of what a rule of law and judicial system should look like, but also at the same time never forgetting the realities of the way most people in the world live, with basically no recourse to anything that we would consider a reasonable justice system.
Well, just pushing on that, in many failed states, it's a target-rich environment in terms of what has gone wrong. What are the institutions most important to address in terms of valuing human dignity?
Well, I would say that justice institutions are important. I think that the key is when people have rights to certain services, education, health, recourse to going to the courts in theory, but actually can't exercise them. If someone doesn't really have means to get to the HIV/AIDS clinic, or to be able to trek across a province of a country and have a lawyer help represent them, then there's a problem. So I think that I wouldn't name one particular ministry or one particular function, but that gap of accounting for people who are marginalized, not really having means to take advantage of something that exists on paper for them.
I think when people are asked what is most important, the most common answer that I'm seeing and reading is security. In other words, people want to be safe. And they want also the security of knowing that their property is not about to be taken away from them, whether by robbers or by government. So I think the security we have to recognize is a huge issue. I was actually talking to someone who works in the Philippines recently, who's very much a social justice fighter, and I asked him how he was reacting to the new regime. And his answer was, I'm absolutely appalled by what Duterte is doing, but 70% of the poor people who I work with support him, or more than 70%. So I think we have to recognize that. Then after that, I think what I hear and read is what people care most about is the future of their children. And so even in refugee camps, and people in the most desperate situations are concerned about their health and about education. So, and that often in a development agency in a failed state situation, that is the base case. That's all you can try to do, even though it's awfully hard to run an education and a health system in a failed state.
So a generation or two ago, I think there was the widespread assumption that the world would get increasingly secular. And that has not turned out to be the case. In fact, I think there's a chapter in your and Tony's book that Nicole Sadaka contributed, showing that actually the world is getting more and more religious between the three great faiths. What impact does the increased religiosity of the world's population have on development efforts?
We may have slightly different views on this, and it is indeed more the career focus for Catherine on the role of faith in development, including in an important phase of her career at the World Bank, advising the president of the World Bank on those issues. But I think it's counterintuitive. I think the view of most secular students of international affairs and policy, is based on the gut instinct that somehow the world will be more riven by conflict, more violent as a function of increased religiosity. And I think in particular, people associate, violent extremism with religion. But I think it's really important to see the possibilities for a commitment to the right kind of holism on development that would come from faith, and recognize that there are some really valuable actors, whether they be large organized houses of worship, engaged in philanthropy, engaged in good works, as we Christians call it, and people who might begin to recognize that violence has to be grappled with, and that their faith calls upon them to look at people who are not just their co-religionists, but others as being of value.
I guess I do have a slightly different perspective. I'm more persuaded by something that Karen Armstrong said in one meeting that we were at together, where she said, it's basically the revelation of the importance of religion in the sense of removing the veil. In other words, it was there all the time, but you had a very powerful tendency to strip it out of education, out of the training of people who work in development. People are uncomfortable with it, so that it's more the blindness, the failure of religious literacy that has been the issue more than any change. Now, religiosity is hard to measure. I mean, I use all the time the figure that Pew has come up with, that 85% of the world's people adhere to some kind of religious tradition. You got China somewhere in the mix. But the point is, it's a lot, and it's obviously very important. I think perhaps what's better to focus on is the changes that are taking place within religious demography, but also within religious practice. So you have huge changes taking place in this country. The rise in the spiritual but not religious or unaffiliated. You have people identifying in some places much more sharply with their religious identity compared with others in reaction to some of the forces of globalization. You have many more tendencies towards plural societies where people have to live together in much closer proximity. So I think it's more not so much that people are really becoming more religious, which is hard to judge anyway, but that the nature of it and the way that it affects other sectors is enormously important.
So before we turn to audience questions, I want to ask you both about empowerment. So one of the challenges, of course, of empowerment is that the group who don't feel particularly empowered may feel relatively diminished by the empowerment of other groups. You mentioned Rwanda, and the convenience of the fact that the empowering of women and girls there was made a little bit easier by the fact that most of the men had been wiped out. You also both speak about the importance of social cohesion and recognition. So as a development expert, grounded in the idea of human dignity, how do you approach the challenges of empowerment without increasing the social unrest of an already fragile society?
Well, so I've urged that we focus on people's value as humans rather than their identity. But I'm not blithely unaware of the fact that so many societies, and apparently our own in the United States, are heavily focused on differences and identities and counter-identities. First of all, you have to grapple with the problem that, sadly, many people who crave recognition, as all human beings do, pursue it at the expense of another group. If you recall the novel To Kill a Mockingbird, it's all about the story of a poor white man who commits an unspeakable act because he's in such an unfortunate situation and he's going to push someone lower down, the rung of society. I think empowerment is out of vogue as an expression, but I've heard scholars in policy, colleagues of mine, kind of, wince when you use the expression.
What's the hip term?
Well, agency is hip for some, but I really do think Catherine captures what's important here, that you can have a sense of a direction of progress and something to be learned from others, but the development path of a society and of individuals has to be their path. Otherwise, big, remote institutions are ending up, engaging in a sort of a new form of colonialism.
There are many different theories of change. I'm teaching my first class tomorrow, and I want the students to think about how they think change happens, the theory of change. But clearly one of them is that it's competition. That's one of the economic ideas, that people are driven by competition. And it's amazing how often the metaphor of the level playing field is brought out. You want to have sort of fair rules of the game, but somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. So I think that that's an intrinsic problem that we have to grapple with. But the point you're raising, I think, is a very important one, that the groups, when there is a focus on the groups left behind, the ones who've been the kings of the roost, to use, are the ones who resent it. I mean, we're seeing it in spades here. And in a number of societies where there has been some empowerment of women, which is by far the largest group that's disempowered, let's not forget that, we have to focus on sort of redefining masculinity. And you'll hear again and again, let's not forget the boys, let's not forget the men, now that we have we've started to make some corrections for the women. So clearly it's a big problem, particularly if you buy into this idea that competition is, in a sense, what drives innovation and what drives us forward towards progress.
Great. So we're going to turn now to what is always the most dynamic and interesting part of the evening, the conversation part of the evening, where we get to hear from you, and I see hands going up all over the place. I'm actually going to stand up to the podium so I can see everybody. And those of you who have been to Trinity Forum events before know that we have but 3 simple rules for our question and answer time. And that is, we simply ask that all questions, 1, be brief, so we can hear from many different people. Secondly, that they be civil. And third, that all questions be in the form of a question. So have 2 friends with microphones. Please wait until the microphone gets to you before speaking. And we'll start with Joe LeConte right there.
Thank you, Cherie. Thank you, Mark, for a very stimulating discussion, and a very stimulating discussion right here. Picking up this religious theme, if I could now, I'm Joseph LeConte with King's College in New York City. And thinking as an historian here, every advance in human rights and human dignity in the West, virtually every advance, I think it's fair to say, it's been led by or inspired by people of deep religious conviction, quite often Christian conviction. So in light of that fact, which I don't think is really a debatable fact, in light of that fact, what's the role then in a relationship of governments here in the United States, our Western allies, as they interact with these faith-based players trying to advance human dignity, who are motivated by their religious convictions? Do governments, as you understand it, do they properly respect the religious identity, the independence, the religious convictions of these groups, or is your experience that they're trying to press them into their own secular mold, secular way of thinking? That's the question.
Well, of course, there are many governments in question here, whether it's Western governments or governments of the global South. But generally speaking, let's just talk about the global North for the moment. I think there is a discomfort with the faith-based community. It's absolutely demonstrably the case that changes of paradigm shifts of beginning to see new groups of people as human beings in full have been driven by faith-based groups. But governments have a tendency to try and deal with faith-based groups in a way that you might deal with other civil society actors. There are some things that are reasonable to ask. If you were to give funding from the government to a faith-based actor, it's reasonable, like any actor, that you measure, like Catherine and I have been talking about, and see whether what they're doing is useful. But when it's not a funding relationship, it's not a formal partnership, then there has to be a kind of empowering ethic on the part of governments. Now, it's a whole more complicated matter around the world when there are societies very divided with different religious groups. And there it's not only a sort of state versus non-state actor, but a question of competing communities, if you think about India, for instance. And then that becomes all the more complicated.
I'd basically give a similar answer, which is the huge diversity of arrangements between public authorities, whether it's national, local, including international, by the way, and the huge variety of religious organizations. In fact, it's one reason why there's an appeal, particularly of interreligious, because that gives you some basis for actually talking about this complex, diverse set of institutions as a single community, not necessarily very accurate, but still it allows you to do something that most governments try to do, which is to have balance and equity among different communities.
Great. Right here, Michelle.
Thank you. Michelle Clark.
Microphone.
Michelle Clark, George Washington University. Thank you, both of you, for this discussion. I think I'd like to understand more, Mark, about your definition of dignity. It seems a bit subjective as you describe it. For example, the Abrahamic creeds that you talk about can define it in different terms. But how do you assess for example, the case of FGM? Does that enhance the dignity of a woman in some culture if she's marriageable? Or does it detract because she is harmed and maimed? Do you think that we need to redefine more objectively these ideas in terms of harm? Does an action harm an individual, or does it not harm an individual?
Well, you raise a good example with female genital mutilation or cutting, in that there are many of those who are doing it are females to their daughters, and in a cultural context, they are asserting their identity or what they know to be their tradition. This is not new to our discussion tonight, that when often Western-driven dialogue about human rights raises an issue about a universal matter, there's the pushback of the cultural context. But the FGM example is important, in looking at agency, and whether someone has a sense that they've lost their agency. And that's it's a curious expression of the human rights field, but some people have to be taught that they have human rights that are being denied. That is ultimately highly subjective territory. I've set like kind of a grenade in my own argument that can go off at any time, which is I'm saying you need to measure agency and recognition. That's where the hard part starts.
Catherine, anything to add?
The FGC issue is a very interesting one, and we've been actually at the Berkeley Center having quite a bit of debate about it recently, because it's come onto the U.S. Consciousness for a variety of reasons, because of the Michigan case, as well as what's going on in Virginia. But there, I think I find it easier to argue against it in human rights terms, the rights of the child. You could call it agency, that a 2-year-old doesn't have much choice. Right. Or even someone who will never get married. But then you also, the arguments that are the most effective, in fact, are the health arguments in terms of dealing with communities. So I think what it does emphasize is the complexity, and the fact that so many of these dimensions, in fact, can't easily be separated. They intertwine in all kinds of ways. I mean, we had a very clear argument in the Berkeley Center that this is not a religious freedom issue. There are a whole set of reasons for that, but there are people who are trying to make it. I guess the court case is being argued on a religious freedom basis, which we would strongly object to.
I just would add quickly that if you were to place harm at the top of the priority list, you do head towards a kind of utilitarian argument, of measuring various forms of harm, and that can be just as subjective as agency and recognition.
I'll go right there.
Thank you. My name is Wade Channel. I'm at USAID, where I have the privilege of working on women's economic empowerment and equality issues. But I don't want to ask about those. I want to go back first, and thank you for a very gracious and thoughtful discussion. But Mark, you started with the Book of Common Prayer, and I'd like to return there and ask each of you to respond. I am, well, I won't say weekly, but frequently have the privilege of praying a very simple prayer of, Lord, I confess that I have sinned against you in thought, word, and deed by what I have done and what I have left undone. I have not loved you with my whole heart. I have not loved my neighbors as myself. I am truly sorry and I humbly repent. That, of course, is a lie, but the rest is quite truthful. I do repeat it in hopes that it will someday be true. My question to you for this group is thoughts on of what should we be repenting? That which we have done and that which we have left undone. And let me just take off the plate the expat savior syndrome and our tendency towards superiority and belief that we have answers for others that we may indeed not have. But what would you see as, what are one or two things that we should repent of that we have done or left undone? Thank you.
Well, Catherine alluded to this. In the area of what we have done is to think that, we, by which I mean, USAID, where you work, the World Bank, the UN, various institutions, has the formula for development. And there is a path, and all we need to do is hand the map to various people. That is something that we should repent for. But I think there's overemphasis on that now. I mean, I think I engaged in it a moment ago by suggesting that there's a danger of a kind of neo-colonialism. I do think that we ought to focus more on that which is undone. And I don't want to over-extrapolate from an issue that I worked on a bunch over the last 18 years, but human trafficking is an issue where there's kind of slavery today, and we haven't done enough. We have denied its existence, and even as we now have a sense that it exists, there's so much that is undone. There's so little money mobilized towards that. It's sad that there isn't more progress and more funding going towards fighting AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, which is my business now. But by comparison, a crusade has been mobilized against those, and the funding has not matched the rhetoric on human trafficking. Undone is where I would focus on repentance.
I have been around this for a long time, so I have a long list of personal confessions that I could make. But in terms of where I think we've gone wrong, I have three things maybe just that are not necessarily of the same magnitude, but that are a bit my hobby horses. The first one is that there's been far too little attention to the implementation side of how things work, and far too much on so-called technical packages, or sort of the planning side as opposed to the implementation. So I think that that's clearly something. I think that we live in a world where there's far too much faddism, and that drives institutions and discourse far more than it should. But then the one that for me that keeps me awake at night or whatever, it sort of comes under the responsibility to protect. I mean, the horrific things that have happened. I worked on Rwanda in the 70s and early 80s, and we saw it coming in many ways. We saw it coming in Burundi. We've seen it coming in DRC, and yet we didn't put the energy and the will into whatever it took and whatever it takes now to fix South Sudan. I mean, I just can't believe what's going on in South Sudan, CAR, these other places. It's just, it's beyond anything that we should be accepting in 2017. So I think that, to me, the finding better ways to deal with that and to exercise a responsibility to protect that is first of all about life and limb, but that also could go into some of the issues of justice we were talking about before.
Right. right here, second row.
Mark and Catherine, I'd like to ask you follow up on that question about implementation. And my question has to do about, in the U.S. context, when we think about the U.S. assistance budget and the fact that the administration submitted a request that's 30% below the current levels. But in thinking about what is behind that, I think there's a very real and deserved criticism of our foreign aid and its effectiveness and its sustainability. So, every one of us can think of foreign aid programs that were implemented and then, the assistance providers left, and a few years later, everything went back to the way it was before. So the question is about sustainability and its relationship to this implementation and a dignity approach. And my question is, I'd like to hear your thoughts about the role of values and beliefs with regard to sustainable, what we're really talking about is sustainable change. So if we think of assistance as and the role of changing people's perspectives and behaviors, and that being so important in effective implementation of assistance, whether that's malaria fighting or infectious diseases or sanitation or what have you.
When I was working on my doctoral dissertation many moons ago, I used to say ideas have consequences, and my wife would say, if you say that one more time, I'm going to slap you. But that, the hard part of development policy is trying to inculcate ideas. And I think one of the ideas that is suffusing our discussion tonight is to take advantage of the ideas, the beliefs, the faith of people that exists in the developing world and mobilize it towards dignity. That's something, if you really can tap into the existing beliefs of people, that could create some sustainability. Sure, we need to look at well-designed programs and implementation plans and so on, but I think that's something that one needs to take advantage of. I can't leave your question, and it's, sort of reference to slashing budgets without saying that, let's be fair. I've worked for Republicans on Capitol Hill and in the executive branch. I'm supposed to be skeptical about foreign assistance. I'm supposed to be skeptical about government. But, let's face it, the foreign assistance budget is a very small part of public spending. Most of what the United States does is philanthropy that comes from the private sector and from the religious community. And there are those who believe that you're going to reform foreign assistance by squeezing its budget because tough decisions will have to be made. I'm not convinced that policy will get smarter just because you're pressuring it to be smaller. There are things out there that are working, and you can say I'm biased because it's my job, but I am a real advocate of some partnerships that have been formed in recent years, and the Global Fund is an example of a new kind of financing that is not driven only by states and public institutions, but incorporates faith-based actors and civil society actors in business. And we ought to look to scale those at the same time as we're spending so much time in Washington looking at how we might slash public sector programs.
I think your question really did bridge a whole set of different issues, but let me pick out two what I would call very separate questions. I'm sure everyone here knows this, but we haven't said it. So what is it? Everything's been said, but not everyone has said it or whatever. But there's a war going on between sort of development pessimists and development optimists. But I think that the basic story is that there has been remarkable progress. And we should, in all of our critical spirit, never forget some of the dramatic progress that that's been made. Now, we do have, I think, a very clear set of challenges right now between the countries that are moving in reasonable directions and positive directions, and the very hard-knot group of countries which are the failed, fragile states that really are much more difficult, and I think they're very, very difficult solutions. I have no idea how if somebody gave me a magic wand, well, a magic wand I could deal with, but some power tomorrow about South Sudan, I don't know what I would do to try to address that problem. So I think that the overall story does not come through of the positive side of it. I think the religious issue is a different one, and it is that these sort of institutions of the United Nations and the bilaterals, most of them, pretty much across the board, a lot of private sector companies, a lot of the big non-religious NGOs, a lot of universities have basically sort of not taken the religious world into account. And even the big faith-based institutions, World Vision, CRS, Samaritan's Purse, et cetera, many of them operate with almost an entirely non-religious modus operandi because we haven't found the bridges, the ways to take this faith dimension into account. And to me, it's far more important to take it into account for the people we're working with, and to see how, I mean, even the strict institutional structures, let alone the way that beliefs affect behavior and daily practice, it is a huge vacuum and gulf. And it is, I know because I have scars on my back from dealing with it in the World Bank, where Jim Wolfenson was always pleased to say that it was 184 countries to 0 in favor of having a dialogue, not money, dialogue with religious institutions. And you see people skirting away from it. So I'm delighted that you're doing this, but it is a much more difficult issue than anyone, I think, had imagined when people started to get into it.
We'll take one more very short question with very short answers. And this time we'll go to the back, right there. Scott.
Hi, I'm Scott Morgenthaler with JP Morgan. And although I'm not here in a professional capacity, I have a difficult time taking off my investor's hat. I was just curious, from your vantage point, if there have been any investments that have impacted this space that have particularly stuck out to you, either in their approach or in the results that have been of which come accomplished from that.
Well, I just mentioned a couple of things that I think is interesting, and in fact, banking is intriguing. Every sector has particular things it's interested in, but there are some who look at that sector and sort of associate it with bad things, robber barons and the like. But it's really interesting how certain parts of the banking community have focused on women and this issue of women and girls as squandered assets. And I think that kind of investment in research and mobilizing financing to women to become empowered because it's actually going to help economies around the world grow, that's been a great example. I would say just one other thing on a very different kind of example, that an investment not of money, but of comparative advantages. I think this is an insight I tried to allude to in my remarks, that the things that businesses can give that are most valuable is not philanthropy and money, but it's their know-how. And I think what's fascinating to me is learning just how much a Coca-Cola or a Chevron or an Exxon has contributed to combating AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria by getting those medicines and medical equipment the last mile to the people in remote areas because they know how to deal with supply chains. That's an investment of sorts.
Just to give three quick comments. First, I think the social entrepreneurship is a whole area that's been transformational and has lots more potential. The second is the mobile phone revolution and what that's done for the lives of people in many parts of the world. And then the third is just medical progress, which really, I mean, the AIDS story is phenomenal. It's a story of a generation that has seen just a complete transformation, but some of the vaccines and so on, that mostly was private initiatives that have driven those changes.
Great. Mark, Catherine, thank you very much. We do have Mark and Tony's book available. I know there are many questions yet to be asked, yet to be answered. We commend that to you. It is for sale for $26 just outside the door. You might even be able to convince them to sign it. In addition to commending their book to you, we also want to extend an invitation from the Trinity Forum to each of you, which is to join the Trinity Forum Society. We hope you've enjoyed your time here tonight. We also hope you will join the society and make this opportunity available to more people. At a time when so much of public discourse has broken down, when there's more divisiveness than ever, we try to create a space that is characterized not only by robust intellectualism and ideation, but also warm hospitality for thoughtful leaders to grapple together with what matters most in a faith-based perspective. Your joining the society helps make that possible. There are also many other benefits, including our quarterly readings, such as some that you will see just outside. We publish these quarterly, where we provide some of the best excerpts of literature and letters, along with introductions that explain why they are of relevance and significance to busy leaders today. Discussion questions in the back that make them an easy book club in a bag for all of your book groups and small groups who may want to discuss some of life's best literature. We also are expanding to other cities, and in the next few weeks we will be having events not only in Nashville, where we've been there for 7 years. In Atlanta, we just launched in February with a 2-year initiative on character, civility, and pluralism. And September 19th, we'll be launching in Indianapolis as well, featuring Mako Fujimura speaking on culture care. If you have friends in those cities, please let them know. We'd love to see them. And again, joining the society helps us continue to grow and affect more cities as well. All of my colleagues should be around. If you're here, if you could just stand up and wave your hand, they can very much help you out with becoming a member. And as a special inducement just for tonight, anyone who joins tonight will get a free copy of Mark and Tony's book, Human Dignity and the Future of Global Institutions. So we hope that you will do that. We also hope that you will come back and join us for future events. So our next event here in Washington, D.C. is September 28th. It is the third in our series on faith and international development. We will be meeting just next door in the ballroom, and we are delighted to be joined by World Bank President Dr. Kim. We hope that you will be joining us as well. As ever, it is always appropriate and fitting to end with thanks, and each of these events means that there's many people behind it who deserve our thanks. So we really appreciate our sponsors, the New Venture Fund and the Gates Foundation, which have made this evening possible. We have had some terrific volunteers help us out. Caroline Grace Brothers, Hannah Wolf, Ashley Winters, Amanda Zeismer, intern emeritus John Huff. We really appreciate our excellent photographer, Clay Blackmore, my own dynamite colleagues, including birthday girl, Colleen O'Malley, wish her well, Alyssa Abraham, Ashley White Brothers, and Joanna Tolles, our intern. And we so appreciate the deeply thoughtful remarks and expertise brought to us by our speakers, Mark Lagon and Catherine Marshall. Thank you very much to each of you. Thank you to you for coming, and good night.
Thank you. Bonnie, Grace, and gracious, and the way you do this. Thank you.
Glad if it's enough. Good. Good. Well, we can chat even more there.